Hello everyone, good morning. Thank you for coming to a material design guide for Android developers. My name is Yash Prabhu. I'm a software engineer and Android team lead at DramaFever, an international media streaming company recently acquired by Warner Brothers. So you can find me on Twitter at YashVPrabhu and on GitHub at YPrabhu, and you can learn more about DramaFever on our website. There are seats here if anyone wants to come up ahead, 1 and 2. Cool. So let's start off with why I'm giving this talk. So recently at DramaFever, we rewrote our entire app. We did not follow material design guidelines for the longest time. So we worked with our designers. We figured out how to change up our entire screen, our entire app, and each screen was revamped. So in that process, there were a lot of lessons learned, and I wanted to share it with the Android community. The design docs for material design are excellent, and the developer documentation is also great, but there wasn't a way for us to put both of them together. So this talk is meant to bridge the gap between the design and the development documentation. Right. So material design was introduced by Google in 2014 as part of the Lollipop release. And basically, it is inspired a lot by print design. So you will see a lot of bold colors, images, typography, a lot of things that you would see in magazines, but it is brought into a virtual world. So let's take a step back and look at the different kind of mobile devices out there and what sort of guidelines they use. When the iPhone was first introduced, it followed a design guideline called skeuomorphism, which is basically the it's a virtual representation of the physical world. So the books in the iBooks app looks exactly like how it would look on a library shelf. And then you have flat design, which you can see in Windows phones and Surface tablets, and everything is laid out in tiles. So you have all these square tiles that are laid out on one surface. But the con of this is that you are not sure if these UI elements are clickable or not, because there's no shadow, there's no elevation, so you don't know what's going on here. Can I click this or not? So along comes material. In material, you have the concept of shadows or elevation. So you can see that these tiles here, or what we call cards, are they have a bit of elevation. In this case, about 2 dp. And when you click on it, there is a ripple effect. So it indicates to the user that I can click on this and I can interact with this card. So material is the best of both worlds. So some terminology for those of you who are new to Android. I'm going to use some of this as we go. Screen sizes are basically from small to extra large. That's your phones to TVs. And screen density is LDPI up to XXX HDPI. Orientation is either landscape or portrait. Resolution is the physical pixel of the device. And density-independent pixel, or DIPs, are virtual pixels. And this is how you would convert pixels to, dp to pixels. So if you have a 240 dp screen, 1 dp equals 1.5 pixels. All right, for the rest of the talk, we're going to focus on 5 major parts: style, layout, animation, components, and patterns. Let's start with style. In Android, you usually define a style for a view. So if you have a button, you can say, I want this button to have this property. So this is the font size, this is the width, this is the height, and so on. In style, I'm going to talk about color, theme, typography, and imagery. So let's start with color. As I mentioned before, in material design, there is the usage of bright and bold colors. So Google has a system of numbering these colors. So you can see 500 is the primary color, and there's a hex code associated with it. And the primary dark color is 700. And the accent color is usually a contrasting color from another. So in this case, if this is pink, the contrasting color would be yellow. So to figure this out, you can go to materialpalette.com, and then in there you get to choose 2 colors, your primary color and your accent color. And once you do that, you get a bunch of other colors that you could use. The dark primary color, accent colors, light primary color, and so on. We'll talk about how this actually applies to your app. So if you're a designer, if you do not have a designer, you can use the materialpalette.com to figure out what combination of colors you want to use. So to get material on your app, you have to use theme.appcompat. And this is a dependency that you can add in your build.gradle file. And this is something that goes way back to Android 2.1. But with prior to that, before material guidelines were around, we all had to use theme hollow, which was introduced in Android 3.0 and refined more in 4.0. So with material design guidelines, with the AppCompat library, now there is like a standard set of guidelines that we can use across all Android apps. So just like you would apply a style to a button, you can take that same style and apply it to a theme. So you can define your style name as base style, and it inherits from this parent, which is AppCompat light no action bar. And remember the different kinds of like primary colors and text we talked about. This is how you can define all of that. Your color primary is a 500, which is say pink. Your color primary dark is a 700, which is a darker pink, and the color accent is yellow 500. So this is how it all sets up. So your color primary goes right to the top, which is your status, which is your app bar, and your color primary dark goes to the status bar, which is where you see your notifications and your battery and all of that. And your text color primary is basically the primary text that you would be using across your app. And the window background, navigation bar color, all of these things which are generated for you by Material Palette, you can use it right here. So to use the AppCompat library, make sure you use this dependency, compile com Android support AppCompat, and again, you can take it all the way back to Android 2.1. Right, so we'll move on to typography. So make sure you always use scale pixels. A lot of people use DPs when it comes to text, but make sure to use scale pixels because it will scale across various devices. And make sure to also use 12 SP where you can, because Android Studio tells you you can't go beyond that. So it just highlights that section and says minimum is 12 SP. But it's, again, these are guidelines. It's up to you whether you follow them or not. So one of the cool things that Google did recently was revamp their fonts.google.com website. And it has tons of open source fonts that you could use. All you have to do is download the TTF file and use it in your app. And here's a combination of fonts you could use: Open Sans and Roboto. If you want to use custom fonts, you can use Chris Jenkins's calligraphy library, which makes it really easy for you to add custom fonts in your XML as well. So if you're using custom fonts, you can just download the TTF file from the open source, wherever you get your open source Google font from, and then use this code to use the typeface. And with Chris Jenkins's calligraphy library, all you have to do is use this font path and then point to where your fonts are available. And that's it. So let's talk about one of the cool things about material design, the concept of using strong, bold images. And one of the cool things that you could do is use the palette API. So here's a demo app that I have where I'm extracting colors from the image. And you can see that I've extracted 6 different colors: vibrant, vibrant light, vibrant dark, muted, muted light, and muted dark. So what I've done is taken the muted color and then added some alpha to it, some transparency, and I've placed it behind the text of the city. And by doing this, you're adding something special to your app. This is something fun that you can do with your app, like just extracting the most prominent colors and just adding it to your app. So to use this, use the dependency Android support palette. And again, this goes all the way back to 2.1. For the palette API, here's the code you use. You just make sure that you generate a list of colors from your drawable. And here's a palette listener. All the 6 different kinds of colors, you can extract all of that. And this is how, as I mentioned in the demo app, I'm taking the muted color and applying it to the background of the text. In the DramaFever app, we're doing this for different shows. So the first show, the prominent color is gray, and the second show, the prominent color is black. So we're using Palette API here to, to change the background of the information. Let's talk a little bit about other kinds of images that you would be using. So far, a lot of you here might have used PNGs and JPEGs to create like 5 different versions: LDPI, MDPI, and so on. So if you're using raster images, if you want to create icons, you'll have to create or tell your designer to create 5 sets of images. And for that, you would just take all of that and then bundle it into your APK. Now, you can do that, but a better way of doing this is using vector images. And that basically uses math to draw all these shapes using points, lines, and curves. So we'll see how we can do that. Once you get your vector asset from your, if you want to create a vector asset, you can just go into your resource folder, say new vector asset, and it gives you an option to choose one from the material icon library, or you can create a local SVG file here. And oops, I think we skipped a slide. Yeah. So this is what an SVG XML looks like. So you can see that the opening tag is vector, and then it gives you the width, height, and the path here, which defines what the icon is going to look like. I've shortened it so that it fits into this slide. And once you want to add it, it's pretty much similar to how you would add a regular ping or a JPEG to your image view. All you have to do is Android source, add drawable, and the name of the file. In this case, IC color lens is an XML file, which is an SVG. So that's it. We talked about style. Let's talk about layout next. In this, we're going to talk about keylines and grids, an important concept in material design, device metrics, responsive UI, and breakpoints. So let's start with keylines and grids. I don't know if that is very clear, but basically, everything that you lay out in your app should be in an 8 dp baseline grid, but except for typography, text goes in a 4 dp grid. So if you look at a screenshot of this, the Gmail app, from the left-hand side, there's a margin of 16 dp and a margin of 72 dp, and that's where the text starts. From the right-hand side, you have a margin of 16 dp. So you see these are multiples of 8, and you always align it that way. Make sure you align all your UI elements on that 8 dp grid. So there are some really cool design testing apps out there. This is a screenshot from Android Dialogues, basically, where you can see that these two apps, Keyline Pushing and Material Queue, overlays basically a grid on top of your app. So I've overlaid a grid on top of the YouTube app, and you can see that there's a 16 dp margin where the image starts, and there's a 72 dp margin where the text starts. So you can see that the YouTube app is following the material design guidelines. Right. One more important thing, which is really, really useful, is the device metrics. It's available at design.google.com/devices. Not only does it give you device metrics for Android, but it gives iOS devices and desktop as well. So if you look here, there's an iPhone, and it shows you which platform it is, the width and height in pixels, dp and pixels, and the density. So when you design for something, design for MDPI so you can use it across all the different dips out there. So to make your UI responsive, you can obviously use the amazing Android resource system. So for handsets, you have limited screen real estate, so you can probably fit just 2 columns of items. But for a tablet, you have more screen real estate, so you can fit about probably 4 columns. So all you have to do is create a main activity XML file in this case, and then define your layout and say the grid span is 2. And in case of the tablet, you just have to say if the smallest width is 600 dp, which means that anything that starts off with 600 dp and above, that's where I'm going to show 4 columns. So this is how we do it in the DramaFever app. You can see that we have two layouts, one for anything below 1024 width, and one for anything above 1024 width. So anything below that, we're seeing there's 3 tabs, info, episodes, and reviews. Anything above that, there's 2 tabs, and the layout also changes. So by figuring out your breakpoint with your designer, you can lay out 2 different screens. So here's a wonderful diagram again from design.google.com, where you have the different kinds of screen densities, different kinds of screen sizes, whether it's portrait or landscape. And the breakpoint here at 1024, you can see it, That's where your layout changes. There are other breakpoints that are available: 480, 600, 840. You can see it also defines 4 columns versus 8 columns, and so on. So this is a very useful graph when you're sitting with your designer trying to figure out what should it look like in portrait, or what should it look like in landscape for a phone versus a tablet. And instead of thinking of things like phone and tablet, you have to think of it in terms of breakpoints so that it's easier for you to design across multiple screen sizes. Let's talk quickly about animation. There are some amazing talk about animations today and tomorrow, so definitely go to those. But we're just going to talk about the most basic things that you could use: surface reaction and shadow. As I mentioned right at the beginning, you have surface reaction basically means that it indicates touch input. So if you see a card view here, and when you click on it, the touch point is radiating out. So it indicates that you have touched this card view. And you can also set a bunch of properties on it. Selectable item background basically puts the ripple effect within the bounds of that UI element. And selectable item background borderless puts it outside of the bounds of that UI element. You can also change the color control highlight. The default is this standard gray, but you can change the color control highlight based on whatever color your device is, your app is. Next thing is shadow. All of the card elements that you have, or any UI elements that you have, basically has an resting elevation. In this case, for the card view, it's 2 dp, and for when you click on it, it lifts to your touch. That is 8 dp. And each of the UI elements in the design guidelines has resting and raised elevation. If you're using the standard widgets, you don't have to go and change all of this. But if you're creating custom UI elements, you probably want to define this as well if you want material design guidelines to be applied across your app. So let's talk about components. Let's start off with button. These are common components that you would use in your app: cards, grids and lists, and a stack bar. So the demo that I've been using so far is available at github.com/yprabhu/materialworld. And in that, I have grid, list, and staggered grid. And when you click on it, you get this information about the city, and it's making use of palette API. It has a few buttons and cards and all that. It's forked from Chris Baines' Cheese Square app, and there's some other things that I've added to it. All right. So if you're using any of the material design, if you want to use material design, you want to use all of these dependencies. The palette API, design support library for design widgets like floating action buttons, AppCompat library so that you can use a lot of the material design options that you have out there, recycler view and card view for grids, lists, and cards. So let's start off with buttons. There's 3 kinds. There's flat buttons, which are basically laid out on the same plane, and they don't have any elevation. There are raised buttons, which have some sort of elevation. And then there are floating action buttons, which are special kind of raised buttons, but they're circular and usually for primary actions on promoted actions on a device, on a screen. So you have flat buttons. When you click on them, they do raise to your touch. And raised buttons raise further, and floating action buttons also lift to your touch. So you can see that floating action buttons here can be used for like starting a show, starting a hangout, writing an email, and so on. So going back to the demo app, you can see on the left-hand side, there is a GIF here, which when you click on it, you can see the ink ripple radiating out. So this is on post-21 Lollipop devices. And on the right-hand side, you have it for anything before Lollipop, and you can see I'm just changing the color when you click on it. So for post-Lollipop devices, just like you would add a selector on your button, you can just pretty much do this and then have different drawables for a press state and a normal state. And for pre-Lollipops, this is a workaround. You can just enclose it in a ripple tag so it gets that ink ripple effect. Let's talk about floating action buttons. In this case, you can see that the floating action button is placed on top of that masthead region. So when you click on it, maybe you start a show. And as I mentioned, everything has resting elevation and so on. So the default elevation for floating action buttons is 6 dp, and the normal size is 56 dp. But if you wanted a fab, which is a smaller size, then you can go with the mini size option. The icon within it is always 24 by 24 dp. And we'll see how to do this in XML. So the design support library that you're using, just make sure you use that same thing, floating action button. You can also create your own floating action button from scratch, but the design support library gives you this option, so it's easier to go with that. In the Android source, make sure you're using that icon that you want to use. If it's IC Discuss, that's that icon, which is 24 by 24. And you can check if it's clickable, whether the fab size is normal or mini, and you can figure out where to anchor it at the bottom right corner and so on. In the YouTube app, you can see that it's anchored in the bottom right corner. Let's talk about cards. The cards are usually used when you want it to be an entry point to something else. So here's a screenshot of the Google Keep app, which makes use of the cards really well. And for this, the dependency that you would be using is Android support card view, and the resting elevation is 2 dp, and the raised elevation is 8 dp. It's pretty simple to do a lot of this in XML, as you have seen that, you might think looking at all of this, how am I supposed to do this? But a lot of these things can be done in XML and a little bit of code. So just make sure you use your widget, the card view widget, and then figure out what kind of style you want in it. And you can give it a background here, selectable item background, which is API level 11 and above. And that's it. So let's go to lists and grids. In the app that I have here, you can see three kinds of, you can see grid, list, and staggered grid. So you have, to use that, all you have to do is use the recycler view, and you can get these three kinds of different layouts. So with the recycler view, a quick primer on it, you basically have three kinds of layout managers. You have a grid layout manager for creating grids. You have a list layout, the linear layout manager for creating lists. And then you have a staggered grid layout manager for creating the staggered grid. So staggered grid items are like grid. Staggered grid is like grid, but they're not fixed size items. And finally, you have an item animator, which you can use for animating, basically removing, adding things to your list or grid. You also have a data set, which is a list of all the items you want to put into your list or grid. And you have an adapter, which will bind each of these items to the child views in your recycler view. Very simple to add a recycler view to your layout. Just say that you're going to use the widget recycler view. Make sure the scroll bars are either vertical or horizontal. And then add your recycler view item. If you want to add an image view and a text view, you can do that. And that's pretty much it. To set your layout manager and adapter, you can use any of these layout managers: linear layout, grid layout, or staggered grid layout. The grid span here is defining how many columns you want it to be. And then finally, you can set your adapter, whichever one that you're choosing, on your recycler view. So the last component that I want to talk about is snack bar. This is kind of like a toast, but it has other things that you can swipe. You can have actions on it. For example, if you swipe on your Gmail app, you can see that it archives an email, and it gives you a text saying it's archived, and it also gives you an option to undo it. So a snack bar is a special kind of toast, but you can do other things with it, like you can swipe it away. So there's a bunch of guidelines for it. If it's a single line snack bar, it's 48 dp. If it's multi-line, it's 80 dp. And there's guidelines for the text and the guidelines for the action button and the default color. All of these can be changed. So for a snack bar, just make sure you use this snack bar make archived as a text that goes in there, how long you want it to show, set an action on it. The action that I want to set is undo string, and then a listener, which is a click listener. So when you click on it, it's going to do something like undoing the action that you just created. And then finally, show. I think a lot of us who have used toast sometimes just forget to add show, which is a very important thing. All right, let's talk about patterns, the last part. We're going to talk about one of the cool scrolling actions that you have in material design. Here in the YouTube app, you can see that it's doing, like as you scroll up, you can see that the app bar is being collapsed and the tab bar docks to the top. And you can see something similar on this demo app as well. As I scroll upward, the tab bar gets docked to the top and the app bar is collapsed. And when I go to the next screen, when I click on something, as you scroll up, you can see that the image collapses into the app bar. So we'll talk about how to do these fancy animations. A lot of this, again, can be done in XML. You don't have to write too much code around this. But before I talk about scrolling, let's talk about the different regions and what is app bar, toolbar, and action bar. So an app bar is a special kind of toolbar, and it's basically this region, which is below the status bar. So every app should have this. And we no longer call it action bar. The term right now is app bar. So the status bar is a section which has all your notifications, your charge, your battery charge, and so on. And the toolbar is a region which has things like your navigation drawer, some icons, overflow menus. And then the region below that is the tab bar, which you saw in the YouTube app. And then a region below that is flexible space. And this is a region where you put like images or whatever you want that can have different height. So this is a specialized toolbar. It has a navigation icon, title, filter icon, some sort of action icons, and menu icons. So here's a common pattern that we saw again in the YouTube and the demo app. Generally, your status bar, toolbar, and tab bar are of this height, and that's fixed. The toolbar can be 56 or 64 dp. So going back to the demo app, we want to recreate this. How did we do this in XML, right? So we scroll up, and then you see that the tab bar docks to the top. So to do all of this, we use a supercharged frame layout called coordinator layout. And this layout basically coordinates all the dependencies within its child views. So for this coordinator layout, you have an app bar layout right on the top, which controls the toolbar layout and tab layout. And then you have the view pager. The view pager is the one which has 3 views, one for grid, list, and staggered. And finally, you have the floating action button, which is laid on top of that. So this is how you can visualize this. And in XML, your coordinator layout should have this app namespace, and the toolbar would have some layout scroll flags. It's a must to have scroll on that because the toolbar reacts to scrolling events that is happening in the view pager. So you can also set other flags like enter always and snap. There's like 4 different ones that you can use. And then the view pager should have this string. It says app bar scrolling view behavior. When you add this string to the view pager, the app bar layout knows that the view pager is scrolling, and it needs to react to the scroll events that's happening on the view pager. So if you go back to this, when you have the view pager and it has the layout scroll, the special string resource there, when you scroll, the app bar layout knows that something is happening to the view pager, and it reacts to that event by collapsing the toolbar. So same thing with another common pattern is the flexible space with image. You can see that the flexible space does not have a standard height. You can give whatever you want it, whatever makes sense for your app. So in this app, in the demo app, I have a picture of New Orleans. And when I scroll upwards, it collapses, and the text goes into the tab bar. So it's the same layout. Coordinator layout is your parent layout. You have an app bar layout, which has the collapsing toolbar layout because you want the toolbar which has the image view to collapse. And the collapsing toolbar layout has an image view and the toolbar. And then you have a nested scroll view, which is like a regular scroll view, but it does all of the nested scrolling. It handles all of the nested scrolling. And in that, I have added a linear layout, card view button. You can add whatever you want in it. And then on top of that, you have the floating action button, which you can see disappears as you go on top. So let's see how to do this. Again, the same app namespace, just add that to your coordinator layout. It is your parent element. And in the collapsing toolbar layout, since the collapsing toolbar layout needs to react to the scroll events happening below it, it has to have the scroll flag, and then any other sort of flags that you want to use, exit until collapsed, and so on. Now, in the previous case, remember we used view pager, but in this case, you have a nested scroll view because that's the one which is scrolling. So give it this layout behavior property, string app bar scrolling view behavior. And when you scroll on the nested scroll view, the collapsing toolbar layout knows that it has to collapse the image into the toolbar. So all of this looked extremely complicated when you first implement it, but all of this can be done in XML. So we talked about style. There's a lot of things we talked about. In style, we talked about color, imagery, typography, themes. In layouts, we talked about responsive UI and breakpoints and device metrics. And animation, we talked about surfaces and surface reactions and shadows. In components, we talked about the common components that you would use: button, grid, lists, cards, snack bars. And in patterns, we talked about coordinator layout and scrolling behaviors. So here's a bunch of links where I got the images from. Definitely check out Android Material Design and Android Design Docs and the developer docs. Tons of resources if you're interested in revamping your app and interested in learning more about material design. There's Udacity's Material Design for Android Developers, which is an excellent course. Android Developer Docs as well, Google Material Design Guidelines, and some apps written by the Googlers themselves, the Plaid app by Nick Butcher, Cheese Square app by Chris Baines, and a bunch of other tutorials where you can get more information about coordinator layouts and other common UI elements that you would use. So that's it. I'm really happy to see all of you here. And if you want to reach out to me at Yash Prabhu. The demo is available. It's pinned to my GitHub at Prabhu. And we're also hiring at DramaFever. So if you're interested in that, please come and talk to me. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.